more chairs down there?
This is the last one.
Okay.
I've started the recording for you.
Okay, ready, set? Good morning, Ron Weber, and we'll call the meeting to order at 10:04. And welcome and introductions. Sir.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Stark, and I'm the newer extension forester for Clatsop County, Oregon State, and Mohassaw, Tillamook, and Lincoln County. And I'm just here to see what you guys are up to.
Connie,
I'm sorry.
introduction.
Oh, Connie Moore, the rural seaside area. I happen to live up Hamlet Road.
I should also add I'm a seaside resident. Happily.
Tim Shield, Stinson Lumber Company, and I manage some land in Clatsop County.
And Jed Arnold, I'm with Hampton Family Forests. We also own and manage some property in the area.
Dan Banks, and I live in Napa. I work for Hampton Lumber, and I am also a private timberland owner.
Courtney Banks. I am married to a wonderful forester, and I am a retired agricultural teacher, and now teach preschool.
Julia Decker, Planning Manager, Clatsop County.
Victoria Sage, planner for Clatsop County.
And Pam Birmingham, and member. I'm getting a chair.
And someone else is coming. Oh, no, never mind. My name is Diane Jetty, and I'm rural Jewel LC person.
Oh, yeah, review the summary from last meeting.
I guess you've spoiled me in the past. I left my mail packet at home.
Okay. Yeah.
Give her one of these.
That is a
I
big
actually do
book.
have an extra book for Brady. Do you want
Oh,
to use his?
I just need the mailings, the
Agenda.
pages.
Yeah. I can. Do you want to just use this book for now?
Okay, I'm
And I also
sorry.
have some
How are you
extra
doing?
agendas.
I'll just remember to put it in my.
Really?
And
Oh my gosh.
sorry, everybody, but I work until after midnight.
This is all four. Did you say no chair? What do you need? No chair?
From last time.
They're bringing.
Oh, I got it. It's right here. Oh, okay.
Maintenance guy.
Per person.
Yes.
Per person.
Your guy Friday.
Yep.
Yeah. Reviewed the minutes from last meeting. Correct? And we'll accept those minutes. Could I have a motion to accept the minutes?
A motion to accept the minutes of the last meeting.
Connie?
I second it.
And yea or nay?
Hi. I got to vote.
Thank you. Review the meeting summary. Okay. This is I have 2 copies left. That's the
Oh,
minutes
thank you.
from the
The county library.
okay.
I'll have a binder.
I'll just pass it around. What they want.
Here we go. Okay, it was really interesting. So each area gave their reports. The one I thought was really, you can go through that. The one I thought was really interesting was Mr.
Standing room only.
Okay. Summarize it.
I have extra agendas.
You don't just have
The packets are.
Yeah.
Is there a chair for you, my dear?
They're bringing chairs.
Oh.
But I
We'll ask her to sign in.
I can scoop. Oh,
Here?
Yes, thank you.
So you can review all those, we'll jump over to our stuff. And so what we covered was, and this is what I summed up for those guys. And Elsie Jewell, and we met on the 17th, and the 4 members of the law had agreed that more housing needed to be created, and asked for more housing that could be constructed on forest lands. Mr. Davis, and one of the members of that committee asked, Mr. Davis asked what was driving the need for the housing. Stated that the housing stock in the area was aging, very aging. And there was a strong demand for housing and planning in the area. And example, and we had the example of our new deputy sheriff, excuse me, Family 5 was looking for a house. And then it asked whether there was sufficient water to support such additional housing, which I'll check into. Depends where you're at. And I mentioned the traffic, especially on 26 and 103. Turnouts need to be added there, lower speeds and double yellow lines. And the impact to the community relating to one of the neighbors down the hill, we mentioned the hemp farm, which basically was putting out a great odor, and also discussed the certainty of wildfires, which was a good point. Olstead brought that up. Because people go out in the woods and they don't know what they're doing. They just start fires and they don't know what time of year it is. And there needs to be more advertising of that. According to those signs that say fire restriction, please don't start fire. Need more of those. Did we? Who puts those up?
Usually they're placed at rural fire departments and.
Fire departments put those up?
Well, no, I think the Department of Forestry.
Yes.
I think the Department of Forestry.
On state land.
On state lands, but I don't know about private lands.
Private lands is up to the timber owner.
Yeah.
Okay.
On sign placement.
Okay.
But I do know that most rural fire departments have a sign placed that
So,
tells you, don't burn.
okay, that's a
They
place
put
to
them
start.
in acres and.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
he would at least
No,
direct
no.
you to the right
Okay.
person.
Let's see, asked whether anyone was growing hops in the area. I have no idea. This was not aware of it. Okay.
I don't think so.
So the classic soil and water was really good. And there's a PowerPoint for that too. I think so.
I don't know if they.
I think so.
Did they?
Yeah, came in. There was 2, all so far, yeah, anything that's had a PowerPoint thing, on the website. Jumping over here to line 13, page 3. So we were doing goal 3, and so next 2 days from now, Thursday, they're going to continue goal 3 again, because it's just so much to get over. Get a chance to read that. That's all really good. Yeah, through the time constraints, they're going to have another one. Any thoughts on all that? Please. To add, okay, this is good because I'm going to come back to them again with this same topic and see what we can add to that Thursday.
Regarding fire and posting signs.
Well, this goal 3.
Oh,
The goal 3.
For farming.
Yeah. So, if you had an underlying theme, what could I tell them?
Regarding fire and.
No.
So-
3. Goal 3.
Oh.
Farm.
Yeah.
Farming and, what's it called? Farm.
Well, I know the controversial one is hemp. Hemp growing around residential areas and property value and so on and so forth. I know that that's quite controversial. but I know that there's laws protecting the right to farm. And so I know that there's more regulations for actual marijuana versus hemp, even though there's a similar plant. Hemp farming is under the guidelines of right to farm. And so you don't need to have the special county approvals in order to do hemp, because hemp doesn't have THC, which is the I don't know, psychoactive portion of hemp. So I'm not sure how much the county has control over that.
The county does not
Exactly.
regulate growing cannabis.
Do you guys not regulate the THC
No.
at all? Oh,
The county does not regulate growing cannabis any more than the county regulates growing tomatoes.
because, well, the county could if it wanted to. I'm just putting
But the
that out
county does
there.
not.
But the county does not. Okay, so the county could if it wanted to, but it does not with the THC version. The county would not be able to regulate the hemp growth though, just because it is a farming product and it's just like corn.
Does the county regulate any farming practice?
Well, the county regulates whether or not you're going to farm in specific zones. I mean, zones that are RA or EFU or forestry or AF, those are all zones where you can do farming. I mean, in some of them, it does actually take an $84 development permit to do the farming, and most people don't bother to get it because I don't think most people want to even consider growing their tomatoes to be farming. It's just, where's the cutoff?
What
It
I
is
meant is like,
the large commercial or more commercial farms, then yeah, they technically ought to have a development permit, but it's a type 1, it's as far as we go.
Yeah.
well, I guess what I meant is like then, like what we're doing is more about like planning for what we. I think what we're wanting to look and say, what do we want farming to and general farming and forestry development look like in the future, rather than looking at like like the micro picture or whatever. I think we're looking at the bigger picture more.
Your statement that you made last time, and I'm trying to remember it when I went over it, was when you concluded your agenda, was the part about using the system was already set up for that. Use it. How did you phrase that? Because it's there. It's just people people don't know it. I don't understand it. But.
Well, I think you phrased that well.
Yeah.
Okay. So any more themes? Any more themes and thoughts? You want me to carry away here?
One thing, you had mentioned the hemp farming and property values. And I'm a realtor. I've been a realtor. I've worked out here for 31 years in the rural areas. And I now have a listing on Tweedle Road, right next door, immediately adjacent to the big hemp farm. And so this has been my test case of property values. Everybody that's called to look at it, I've been telling them right up front before they drive out to look, which like you said, if it was a tomato farm, I wouldn't. Or a tree farm, I wouldn't tell them, but I'm telling everybody it's next door to a hemp farm.
Would you tell them if it were a hog farm?
Probably not, because it's a rural
But
location.
hogs and dairy have the same odor, so you
Right,
want to
but
be
I
careful.
don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, but with the owner's permission.
Oh,
I
okay,
represent
that's
the seller.
better. That's- yeah,
absolutely.
definitely, okay.
Because they were concerned. And every single potential buyer that's called has come out to look and said it doesn't bother them. Now, we don't have an offer on it yet, but I have not had one bit of pushback about the odor.
I know in Northern California and Southern Oregon, there have been a lot of pushback in regards to hemp being grown as a commercial or industrial product near school districts and near properties of, multi-million dollar properties. But that's all I know. I mean, I'm not against hemp. I'm an agriculturist. But what I would bring up in maybe the future county planning situations would be having marijuana grown near school districts or marijuana grown near school parks or where children are actively playing. You have to think about, something that is a controlled substance. I mean, it is a controlled substance. It's a drug. And so versus hemp, I mean,
Right.
it's making that distinction between hemp being grown which is like corn. It's not going to hurt the kids. It's not a controlled substance. You know, it's got its uses. So granted, it smells. So do pigs and so do cows. But then you have to look at the THC version being grown within, you know, a locale of a school district or a park where children are playing, or, you know, there's just a stigma, but not only the stigma, but it is a controlled substance. And so as a county, I would think that that would be something that maybe we should look at, because it's becoming more and more popular. It's going to become an issue. If it's not already an issue, it's going to become one.
Suzanne?
I'm sorry.
Well, one thing that was discussed, I don't know if you were there, but about enzymes to digest cow manure because they spray them on the fields on the coast. And that is on one of these meetings that came up, and it is because when they spray cow manure, it's pretty intense. And I think also what's really important on hog farms, when you have high intensity hog farms, there's a Pew Research thing about levels of the gases that are highly toxic. You hear about it on chicken farms too, that sometimes the gases are really bad for the chickens themselves. That when you have high density, the whole thing of when you have industrial grade animal farming of high density animals, I think it's something to really look at. It hasn't happened yet in this county.
And unfortunately, state law protects, or fortunately and unfortunately, state law protects farmers to the right to farm. And so industrial farming, like large size, 3,000, 4,000 cows, as long as they're following their agricultural law, which means their excrement is being dealt with properly, every animal is cared for, so on and so forth. They're not, I mean, they're protected by state law in order to do that, no matter the odor.
But she's right that best agricultural practice evolves over time. So if, you know, for example, we could take we're looking at the 20-year frame going forward, and, you know, for example, Europe was spreading manure, you know, say you've got somebody has a sludge pond or something, and they're going to, you know, scatter that across all the air, you know, it's not necessarily a best agricultural practice. It's just somebody has to make a case that there's something that is taking that place. So, for example,
So that's our job.
So, for example, in Europe, you know, where there's more populated, there's farming all around the populated centers. For two reasons, they inject the manure in, so they, rather than just scatter it in the air, they inject it into the soil, so they don't have the ammonia emissions. And ammonia is also a strong greenhouse gas. So, I mean, obviously, those things we can incentivize, or there's a lot of ways to address that. But you don't need to, just because it's a farming practice that was relevant before we knew how to do something a little better, doesn't mean it's protected if we make the point.
It was a question on the hemp versus the cannabis. I think that is cannabis the marijuana official name for the marijuana one. So is there a difference in the odor when you're growing it between those two plants?
No.
Because
The plant
I know
is very
they're just
similar.
cousins of each other.
Yeah, no. The odor usually, so this is just due to my own research, the odor usually is the most prevalent when it's ripe or when it's ready for harvest, and then during drying process. Now, you could get into, if you're near a residential area and that they wanted to do drying, that they do it indoors with, I mean, there's ways to filter the air so that the smell is not, and there's incentives in order to, you know, so that the smell is not prevalent throughout the entire community. But it's a 2 to 3 month period of time where the smell is, it depends on your olfactory, you know, senses, whether or not that smell is pleasing or not. And for me, it's not. But for others, it may be. And so it's that 2 to 3 month period of time where it's being harvested and then laid in the field to dry. Now, here, I don't foresee it being able to be laid in the field to dry just because we aren't that dry. It's like hay, sometimes we have to turn it 3 or 4 times in order for it to dry. Now, in places like Southern Oregon, it lays, and that's just where it is until it's dried, and then it can be processed.
So is there any common theme takeaway from this for the meeting Thursday? What do you think? Thoughts?
It's
One word, 2 word, 3 word?
Well, can I say, when you say best manure management, to me, that's a doorway into the whole question. What is best manure management? In South
Best
Carolina,
agricultural practice.
Yeah, that's an agricultural practice.
right, because in South Carolina, the pig poop lagoons were flooded. And
Well,
I
you
think
have to take that
management
each
means
state is different.
No, yes,
Yeah.
no.
I know, I understand.
Yes.
Okay.
So we should,
Best ag practice.
yeah, I think so an example of best agricultural practice, there was a case in New York where they were looking at livestock guardian dogs. And they went through, there was the community had some contention about it, so they went through and they just did a little internal study on what, it's pretty easy, we have a lot of resources available to do a study and see what the best practice is. It's almost like a little trial of some kind, to find out, okay, are they using the best agricultural practice? And if not, it doesn't mean you can practice. But I guess the takeaway would be that hemp, for example, could become something that big players come in and buy big tracts of land in the Nehalem River, for example, along the Nehalem River. That's possible. We should be looking at promoting best agricultural practices moving forward.
Yeah, it's possible and probable. I mean, it really is possible and probable because they're having this issue in Southern Oregon right now where, and it's a foresight. We're looking at the next 20 years. It's a foresight of saying this is a very popular ag product right now. And the nut tree,
hazelnut.
Hazelnut, thank you. Where you saw fields upon fields over the last 5 years being planted. So hazelnut was a huge ag product. And yes, it ebbs and flows and it comes and goes, but this is the next upcoming one. And so just being aware, and putting it out there that growing certain products around children, I mean, that's my big trigger because I'm a teacher. Growing products around children is something that we all need to be aware of, and maybe that there should be some sort of state, city, county zoning situation where we know we can protect the kids.
Okay.
What all marijuana growing is licensed by the state.
Yeah, you have to have a
Are
state.
there restrictions within
Yeah,
that
so
as
we would
far
have
as
to,
proximity
county would have to
to
follow
schools?
those.
Yeah.
Oh, probably.
Well, I don't think there is. Everything that I've read, I don't think that there is.
Yes, no, there is. Jewel
And
Jewel
hemp
School
would be
went
a
through
different
it.
category.
Yeah, my brain was in hemp, not in whatever the other official name for the other one
But
is.
there could be a thought process of for example, if somebody had a 1/4 acre of hemp, it's probably not going to affect anybody else. But if somebody moved in and set up a big hemp growing operation, all of a sudden it becomes
Within a mile of the school.
a community concern. Like for I'm not saying a concern like that hemp is bad or good. I'm saying that it becomes something that affects a larger community of people.
To give you an example, I have a preschooler who has lung development issues. And so she was out and in, high medical care for the last 2 weeks just because she got sick. Now, if we added a hemp operation within a mile of the school, that would increase her allergy situation and cause medical issues. There have been proven where olfactory smells will trigger asthma and trigger lung issues in children. And so I'm just about the children. That's all.
So I'm going to go with that, best ag practices, and as time goes here, could we have the go for overview from the staff?
Yes, sir. I just want to say a quick welcome to Diane and Brady Gert. I don't know if they got a chance to introduce themselves as the newest CAC members, but thank you for signing up and being part of this process. And I'm always glad to see lots of faces in our meetings here. So anyway, so just a quick overview of the process itself, what we're doing here, for people who may be a little unfamiliar with the comprehensive plan update. Basically, the county's comprehensive plan is a foundation. It's just goals and policies. It's, as my director Gail calls it, it's the warm and fuzzy document. And then the zoning ordinance is the actual like implementation of those policies. That's where, you know, like regulations and all of that come from. But everything is going to have to be consistent with the statewide planning goals, including especially the goals 3 and 4, which are agriculture and forestry, because there are some really strong state regulations. So as you probably know, goal 4 is the forestry lands. So most everything that is in our comprehensive plan document is based pretty fully on the statewide planning goal. We don't have a lot of opportunity to make changes. However, we can put in language that say we will encourage working with the state legislature to look at these things, but we aren't making any real regulations here. So anyway.
And is it not true that the forestry has the most legislated requirements, uses than any other goal?
I can't say for sure, but they're definitely one of the most regulated.
It's the thickest.
Thank you.
So,
There you go. And now we have Jenna for our guest presentation.
It's not going to be much of a presentation. It's certainly not going to be 15 minutes worth. We read through the existing comprehensive plan from 1982, and it all sounds very familiar. As Victoria mentioned, there's not a lot of wiggle room in the state planning regulations where the counties can act independently. And so really, we just are here to hear the discussion and participate, give information where we can, and if we have any concerns, it's mainly around, I think, the same thing with agriculture, fragmentation, and development conversion, things we definitely want to see.
What does that mean?
Fragmentation of forest lands. If you have generally living, people moving in, it being slowly converted to residential, there's lots of potential conflicts there, both in operational practices. Here, we have it easier, but that down south, that what they call the urban wild interface is where you have a really big fire danger because you have homes in the middle of areas that are not necessarily well suited for homes. And so, we definitely would love, and this is basically what the goals are, if I read them correctly, to avoid that fragmentation of the existing forest lands and avoid conversion of those into other uses. And then I was going to offer that if, people wanted references for good peer-reviewed science on some of the stuff that is discussed, I would be happy to give them up. But now Dan Stark is here, and so I will say, please talk to my colleague at OSU Extension, who does not work in the industry. So he's a good, trustworthy resource. But yeah, mainly just here to participate and listen.
Thank you.
Both of you, or are you on the commission now?
I'm on the commission.
You're just with him to help us?
I'm just here independently.
Yeah,
okay.
I walked in and I know Dan because he's a forestry guy.
Yeah, you're talking about forests and planning, and so that's of interest to me. So I'd just like to reiterate what Jed said, is that OSU Extension is connected with tons of resources. So let me know how I can help, and that includes offering classes if you need to help understand something. I could put together classes, something like climate change and that kind of stuff. So we're willing to offer.
You're based in Astoria? Are you based in Astoria?
I'm based in Astoria. Yeah, my range goes all the way down to Lincoln County, so whole north coast.
and I did forget to mention, I'm sorry, there is we're hosting a basically sort of roundtable discussion next Monday on the 25th at the Boyington Building, which is in Astoria. If anyone needs directions, let me know. From 4 to 7. It is a potluck event. But we have, I think Jed's speaking or you're attending.
I found out about it this morning. So,
Oh.
but I will be attending.
Okay.
What day is
Just
it?
we're really throwing
And
you
your
in the
homework
mix.
was due Monday.
We also have Bob Van Dyke from the Wild Salmon Center, Ashley LaTorra, she's from the Oregon Department of Forestry.
Yep.
Yeah, and then we may get someone from the Crag Law Center to kind of talk about that side of things.
What date is it again?
It is the 25th, so it's Monday, from 4 to 7 at the Boynton Building in Astoria. It's 800 and something exchange. I don't remember.
800, 857.
And the focus is to,
Talk about Goal 4. So to have a roundtable discussion about Goal 4, so we can all just kind of have everyone in the room together.
How many, so has other goals gotten this much attention?
Not so far.
So goal 4 just seems to be the
Three.
three, and well, you were saying this is Monday for goal 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just, because I've been to 2 other meetings regarding goal 4 and, another agricultural one, and I just feel like we're really pounding on goal 4 an awful lot.
It's a hot topic.
it's 90% of our county.
Well, it is. I mean, I totally agree that it's important. But I was curious about this agenda. Who?
We don't have to stand on that agenda.
Well, I know, but who wrote the agenda?
County staff.
So county staff being
County
commission
staff,
or?
no, the county staff, the people
county
who work
staff.
in the planning department devise the agendas. And when we are devising these agendas, it's more than one person. We're usually just going, hey, what should we put on the agenda? And everybody sends email back. And what we're doing is looking at what's in the headlines, what are the things that are coming into our office, what's the legislative agenda that we're seeing, what are these new committees that the state is coming up with, and we're devising questions to bring people to the table and get everybody interested. And it looks like it worked.
Well, no, it worked. I just was wondering if, because we didn't talk about the agenda at all in the last meeting. So I didn't know, was it just an agenda to?
No, we don't have to stay focused there.
Well, I was just curious.
Obviously, we'll get on to other things.
Well, no, I get that. I was just, I'm parliamentary procedure oriented, and when you throw me an agenda, I'm like, let's talk about it. And or I structure, but to just have a piece of paper that's going to each of the county commission committees, and then having a wish list being sent to the well, we should look at these things being sent to the state when maybe 3/5 of the county doesn't agree. I don't know if that should be on the wish list, I guess, or the please look at this, however you described it. I'm not sure how we could give suggestions to the state level or in your memo section or whatever.
The committees are devising goals because we're reopening the comprehensive plan.
Right.
So these are all things that are they're coming up in all of the different goals. We'll be looking at 18 different goals. Goal 4 is only
over the
one.
next 4 years
Yes,
or whatever.
right.
Yes,
So
I understand that.
what we're doing is
Yeah.
getting discussion points out there for people to talk about so that they can devise goals that represent the community's desires for what they do want to see.
Okay. And that will become from,
And the agenda, each group kind of has their own level of formality with these meetings. Some will actually go through all the questions one by one. Some will just sit around and talk about whatever they want to talk about. So it just kind of depends on the group. So the agenda, these aren't, we're not to the level of like the Board of Commissioners or even the Planning Commission. We can run a strict meeting, but these are just,
I guess
if you need something to talk about, here's
Yeah.
some suggestions. If you have something else you want to talk about, please discuss.
I guess my concern was the phrase along the lines of what our county wants the state to look at. That's where I kind of stop and say, because I do know that there are a lot of really emotional feelings in regards to forestry, but to have an agenda where 3/5 of your county are not discussing it, and then having that potentially going into a county commission meeting saying that this should be shared with the state or the Board of Forestry, as we should relook over forest practices law. I really want to throw the brakes on and
You
say
mentioned twice 3/5.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm
so
curious.
this is
if
my
you're 3/5,
second meeting.
okay, just a second. So if you take it there and you say 3/5, I was thinking.
Well, this is just an
So-
analogy, but
So,
yes.
yeah, so the things that are gonna go there are what we have, and if the folks don't show up and express their views,
Right.
or get online and express their views,
Right.
then they're kinda gonna get what's gonna, I'm just making notes of what
And that's
people
why
say,
I'm
and that's
expressing
where-
myself.
So I would
You're gonna get that information,
Yeah.
Do you
Pay
have
forward.
the
yeah.
notebooks? This is what,
Which is all zoning related, to
no,
my
these are-
knowledge.
this is the
Goal.
comprehensive
That's
plan.
from the goal.
These are the goals and the policies related to goal 4. And so you can actually, if you want to, structure your meeting where you go through these and look at them and determine if they're being met, if they're still reasonable, if they need to be augmented, if they no longer matter, if they don't.
True.
So that's another way to look at it, is just to look at goal 4
Thank you.
itself.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to be controversial, I was just trying to
And we aren't gonna be
pump the brakes a little.
just, we're not gonna do anything without process. So these
No, I
will be
understand.
fed into the countywide, which will then be reviewed by staff, which will be taken back to the countywide, which will then be approved to take to the planning commission and then the board of commissioners.
So I guess
it's-
my next question, I mean, it
And it
obviously
may be
has to
that
go
we
through
wanna
the
change it.
board of commission for approval, correct?
Right.
So when would that meeting, because there are so many meetings,
Hold on a second here. I think that a lot of this needs to be a discussion between you and about process with the county, with the people at the county, not in this meeting. Because I think right now that's not one of our.
No, and I
things we're
totally
doing.
understand that.
So-
I was just requesting when the county commission meeting, which would be addressing goal 4, would be with the actual county commissioners.
Probably sometime in 2023.
Oh, bless America. Okay. Well, thank you guys for all of your volunteer service and going through 18 of these. But that was kind of what I was trying to drive into, was when is the actual decision making
So to
occurring?
get on the agenda,
Right.
if there's something we want on the agenda, get a hold of you guys, and it will be on the agenda.
Which agenda are you referring
The
to?
one today. That's from here. That's my only takeaway.
Oh, if you want to have
Yeah, add
something
something.
specifically onto like
Sure.
goal 5 or something like that,
Oh,
shoot
yeah.
us an email.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ron, I
Sorry,
would
but
like
it's
to
like
work
a
through
circular
this agenda.
Oh, me
I think
too.
This is a good agenda.
Okay,
and I would
so
like
we'll
to
come
work
over to
through it.
this one for today. Could somebody give me a definition of a carbon sink, please?
So I don't think that there's a definition of a carbon sink and a definition of what you might be talking about in relation to this is probably a little different. I mean, a carbon bank where you could sell it, it has some sort of monetary value on a carbon sequestration.
Yeah, I think he's talking about sequestration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because like, a carbon sink is effectively any kind of
Farming or agricultural
well,
product.
just process which is going to sequester more carbon than it's going to release. And so wetlands are actually a great example of a carbon sink, probably the best. Carbon gets into those, it sinks to the bottom, and it's there forever unless we do something to screw it up. Or there's a big geologic event.
Or an old growth forest, for example, would be a carbon sink.
Let's see. Yeah, let's see. I wonder how much. Yeah.
What is the benefit of a carbon? That would be my question. Of a carbon sink.
What is the benefit?
So.
When we said we're encouraging goals and policies that would encourage creation.
Ideally, the benefit of a carbon sink would help us suck back out some of the CO2 that we've introduced into the atmosphere through the consumption of fossil fuels. Unfortunately, the way that a lot of politicians tend to look at them is a way that we can keep using more fossil fuels but have less net things that are emitted into the atmosphere, which is kind of the way that the California carbon market works. Arguably works. Dan, I'm sure you could comment. There's some indications now that it's actually not really contributing to any net sequestration. It's a financial tool at the moment, mainly. You can say, I have, particularly in California, what they tend to do in relation to forestry is, I've got this, lot of timber that's really hard to get at. It's on a really steep slope. So rather than try and harvest it, I'm going to sell off the carbon those trees will sequester for 100 years to the carbon market. And then someone else may buy those carbon credits and send more carbon up in the CO2 up in the atmosphere.
That's
Yeah.
not.
What happens if it burns? I mean, that's just what happens
Well,
if that.
Releases
Well,
the
released.
carbon.
Well, I know, but what happens to the carbon credits if it burns?
I know.
From the market's perspective,
From the market's
it's
perspective.
nothing. There's no.
Because they have that 100-year contract to have those trees.
Well, it is 100 intended. I think that the idea is that they'll actually go and maybe harvest those at the end of the. I think it's, so
I
the
mean, does
Astoria
it come with a
watershed is actually a
management
great
contract?
example of that. They sold off their forest for carbon credits, but it's a. What is Astoria, an 80-year, 60-year? Yeah, and hypothetically, at the end of those 80 years, they can then go and harvest those trees, and they keep the money from the carbon credit.
So that question was a carbon sink, was an ecological question, and that's an economic answer, but the carbon sink, I think, is where you take and semi-permanently store carbon in something, usually in an ecological system. I mean, sometimes they come up with schemes that are otherwise, but it's a long-term storage of carbon from the atmosphere into terrestrial form.
Well, farming is a basic form of that. It eats carbon and pops out a plant that you can consume. So, I mean, all farming, agriculture, and timber, I mean, it all, uses carbon for growth in the cycle.
Cycling.
Yeah.
So a sink isn't a cycle. So the cycle would be you take and you release, you take and you release. That's not a sink. The sink would be you
So
take.
you're wanting a long-term sink.
So regenerative agriculture would be a carbon sink. Regenerative forestry would potentially. So if it's documented that you're storing incrementally more carbon in the soil over time, or in the, like in redwoods, for example, they're notorious for storing in, cellulose form instead of in the soil. But all these are carbon sinks where standard agriculture and standard forestry tends to put more over time. The cumulative effect is more carbon in the atmosphere over time. That's not a carbon sink.
I guess that from the research studies that I've read, there's conflicting information on both sides, and I don't think that just like when we discuss our water quality and so on and so forth, there's so many things that fall into what could possibly change, or that I have a hard time
So,
after reading both sides of the coin of saying, well, we should do something like this in our county, or we should make an effort to do something like this in our county, because there's so much conflicting information out there.
The question is, would it be beneficial to create halls?
So there are many, many forest uses, permitted uses legislatively laid out, including fracking, mining, gravel. I mean, there's a ton of uses on forest lands. And I personally have brought this up before. I would love to see one of the uses for trees is that they just be left for carbon capture as a permitted use, stated up front on a forestry use among all the others, because, I mean, right now, we have a 5-year lag time from the time that carbon in the air is intermixed with the ocean surfaces brought down into the ocean. There's a 5-year lag time. We have 30% more acidity in the ocean than I forgot when it dates back to, but it's making oyster larvae. There's a lot of corals are having a really hard time with present day acidic levels. We have not yet worldwide reduced our carbon surface, all that stuff in the atmosphere. If we don't bring it down, not just hold it steady, because we're going up in carbon in the atmosphere, the ocean acidification is going to be terrible in another 10 years.
So how can we, go ahead.
The question, would it be beneficial? And I think, as you said, there is so much
There's so much conflicting.
But when there's
information.
conflicting, and when it's not only the future of our planet, if we think globally, but the future of Clatsop County, because we need our trees to survive. And climate change is having
But
with
that would
Swiss
be
needle
if
cast.
we weren't replanting every time we
No,
harvested.
I mean the health of the trees. Do you think of things
Oh.
like Swiss needle cast? Climate change is affecting the health of our trees. And if we don't err on the side of caution by creating some carbon sinks, we could not only harm our health, but harm the future of forestry.
Can I
But-
offer some clarification
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, please.
So, part of the reason there's so much conflicting information out there isn't actually about the carbon sequestration facet. The science is pretty solid on that. It's how people interpret that in relation to policy, right? So, one thing we have to remember when we're having these carbon discussions is that this is a global carbon budget, right? And unfortunately, and that's where a lot of the conflict comes in. Because if you just look at a harvest operation or even a forestry cycle as in a bubble, it is a net carbon release until you hit it about 90 years in this particular area. If you go somewhere like California redwoods, that scale is pretty much infinite.
You said carbon release.
So if you are on a harvest cycle in this part of the Pacific Northwest and you are harvesting your trees anywhere south of about 70 to 90 years, there is a net carbon release from that operation, including the gasoline that's consumed during the harvest and processing, all that stuff, minus the carbon sequestered in the wood products. It's a complicated calculation. Where that comes down when they start looking at it as a net carbon savings is because if you look at it from the global picture and you say, okay, well, we've harvested these trees and the product has been used in lieu of concrete, and that product has been used in lieu of iron, or that product has been used in lieu of a similar tree harvested in the far northern Russian forest where they don't recuperate, the forests don't come back. Now you're at a net carbon savings because they're figuring in the offset of those products versus what would have been used somewhere else. And that's why it gets like crazy complicated, right? So it's hard to say, well, we need to do this here because we're going to hedge our bets. We're going to do the thing that's the safest because we have to think about what we do here, how it affects the global market. It just gets really crazy complicated, which is why things like wetlands and redwoods are great because there's no question there. We know,
You can't harvest. Yeah. You can't or won't harvest.
I have a good example because I'm going to be going to a training in Santa Barbara in December. It's a scholarship for a 5-year scientific protocol where they're going to test the soil at the beginning. It's called an ecological outcomes verification for soil increasing in carbon over time. And the EOV verification is, so this is a different way than the economic. It's to say that if you farm in the proper way, forestry in the proper way, the soil will get better and better over time, richer and richer in organic matter and deeper in complexity. And so this scholarship pays for the scientists to come out every year, a group of scientists to come to the farm in Seaside every year, and then intensively every 5 years to test the soil and say, okay, here's what it is compared to last year. So this isn't testing the tree or whatever. This is testing one component, which is the soil. Is the soil getting better or worse year after year? And this is a course in like regenerative agriculture. So how to manage livestock and different factors in a holistic way to increase the quality of soil. But these are fairly straightforward. You could say all the different components, but you could say in the county, do we want our soil to get better every year in the mountains, for example, or in the farmland? Or can we incentivize that in some way? Can we, make it possible for local residents to verify that and, have that as a label on their products they market, for example, or on, for example, a forestry product that's able to say that we may, So that's an example anyway, and it's a 3-week course.
So the takeaway I will tell them is it's beneficial.
Well, can I say that in my layman's personal opinion, I don't think it's beneficial, and I just want to make sure that it's for the record, just because our forests here regenerate. We are like the prime area for harvest and growth, tree growth. Our trees grow faster. Our trees grow taller. They're healthier than anywhere else. that that our life cycle, or not life cycle, that's the wrong word to use. The growth cycle of our trees is shorter than anywhere else. And if we weren't harvesting like we do here, then that harvest is going to go somewhere else where they don't have the same growth cycle. They don't have the same speed of growth of trees. We hear about the rainforest burning, and we hear about all of these things that, our forestry management here is amazing. The skill, the education, the biologists, the effort that is put in is amazing. I don't think it would be beneficial for us here in our county to take away lands and create a 90-year carbon sink of something that is not a watershed, or of something that is not that is accessible. So if it were inaccessible or a watershed, I feel like that would be a benefit. But if it's not, or not a wetland, sorry, I got the two words confused, a wetlands, that I don't think that it would be beneficial, because I think we would be damaging the worldwide situation, the worldwide picture, versus allowing us to do our due diligence and our best effort here in our area, which, I don't know. Sorry, you had your hand raised. Go ahead. Go right ahead. I'm rambling now.
I wasn't trying to cut you off.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to put in my 2 cents. Just that I think that these aren't mutually exclusive practices, as long as you consider keeping these forest lands as working forest lands. I think is what I'm hearing. So I think that could work in combination with, it technically is a sink, right? So we're looking at the most basic terms of this. So a source versus a sink of carbon, right? So what are our sources, our industries, that kind of thing? What is a sink? Plants, the oceans, those things that are storing it. So if we keep our trees actively growing on this cycle, or in just the cycles in general, it might be something you want to prioritize, where there might be some set aside lands that are managed for a long period of time, that are specific outside of industrial forestry, something like that. It might be a special kind of land designation you could support, but that has to come with management also. And that doesn't mean we don't keep our hands off of this, because we know that every piece of land and forest that you look at, you're looking at a managed forest. So just keep that in mind. And I'm not saying it has to be logged for commercially, but for forest health, for fire mitigation, that kind of thing. So they don't have to be separate, is all I'm saying. You could support the same goals, say they're beneficial, and we support them, and we support sustainable forestry, which is a renewable resource here.
Thank you for being more eloquent than I.
Well, just to her point, going from Northwest Oregon to, say, inland Idaho, the productivity is like a factor of 5 or 6 times here versus there. And to Dan's point there, you can have both. They're not mutually exclusive. And a little bit I've read into carbon, part of as far as selling carbon credits and the like, they look at your operations. You can remove some timber as long as the net is still positive, then that is allowed under carbon credits.
Yeah. So if you need to fund that forest-based management practices kind of thing. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that, and maybe I'm going to, is it Brad? Brady, sorry, I'm terrible with names. What I'm wanting to see with the forest is to upgrade our practices. I'm not anti-logging completely, but I want to upgrade the whole entire set of practices, like Brady's talking about with the agriculture, because I'm not a biologist, but I actually did one of my term papers on forest ecosystems, but it was just like one term. And I went to the Oregon Extension Service. I bumped into somebody and had them come out, and I talked to them about using, for example, alder to fix the soil. And the gentleman that I was talking to, and this is not to bash the Extension Service, but and it had been a complete conference on it that I had read as part of my paper, he didn't seem to know about it. And of course, this was like over 10 years ago, but what I'm saying is that I'd like to see things like rotating the tree crops, fixing the soil naturally, like with the sustainable farming. I'd like to see some of those things added to our forest practices, so that we're, when we do log, we know we have a better chance of knowing that the next crop is really going to make it. Because I see changes in the trees myself, and I don't think, I think that if we're ignoring those changes and ignoring the fact that, like, I know a tree planter that has had years in the past when they couldn't even plant because the winter was too dry. I feel like we can't ignore these things.
Well, actually, we can't ignore.
Susan? What?
I know it came up at a forestry meeting about just doing cover crops, somehow protecting our soils when we do have a wet winter. That rain, pounding rain, really is hard on bare soils, and there are ways that you can protect the soils doing cover crops and leaving. I was impressed with this, is it Pomsey machines that have the trees actually? And what they left behind were all these branches on the ground, which they ran over and smushed in, and I thought, dang, that's probably protecting the soil and good for carbon too.
So so slash management is a very active one. There's a lot of established science in forestry. Slash management is actually an active area of research, and the thoughts are changing on that. And it ties into one of these right here. Because it says forest landowners shall be encouraged to actively pursue methods of complete utilization of wood fiber left on the ground after harvesting. I would cross that off of your goals. The current thinking is that would not necessarily be the best thing to do. There are things that they're looking at residuals for things like alternative biofuels, which could be beneficial to the worldwide picture, to the local forest ecosystem. You leaving those residuals behind is pretty. I suppose there could be an argument, but most would agree that would be desirable.
It's good habitat.
Well, nutrients, habitat, ground cover.
Soil cover.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Well, I was just,
no, next
Janet.
Well, in answer to some of her wish of the Forest Practice Act, we do have the Forest Practice Act in effect, and it is law. So when somebody does harvest a piece of land, they do have to follow to the letter. I mean, it is law. I mean, you have to follow it, or you're forced to follow it. We have a plan, and we have a very good plan in effect here in Oregon. And as you may want some things changed, but we can't do that at a county level. ORS 527.722 states that you cannot, as a county, just decide that we want to change this. And you can encourage certain practices, but you can't not at a county level say, well, here in this county, you have to do more than what the law actually states.
Unless damages are being done to water systems or what, if there's public health concerns, then the county can step in, but a strong case has to be made, and there's not very much precedent for success in that.
Yes.
Would
Go ahead.
you have your goal for discussion list? Due to time constraints, would you guys go down through there and pick one that is a burning desire to speak on, please?
How can the economic, environmental, and recreational aspects of forest lands be balanced? Isn't that the biggest question, Paul? How do we quit arguing about how to use the forest and make sure that there's access for recreation and that we can use it as a crop and that we can sequester carbon and see the trees.
Without one leg, the whole table is going to fall down.
There
So
you
you
go.
need economic, you need environmental, you need recreational. You can't have recreational without economic because economic pays for recreational. You can't have and the Oregon the Forest Practices Act, we are environmental, and so and with biologists who visit every concerned piece of land, and I know state lands takes their biologists to the T and even further. So I don't have experience in either state or private lands. I'm just speaking from my own personal observations. But I feel like if we go too far one way with, there's a situation that I'll say, between the state of Oregon and the state of Washington. Washington is very different than Oregon. Yes, we kind of look the same, but our soils are very different. Our growth cycles and so on, everything's very different. And going and looking at Washington and where the grass may be greener for some people on the other side, more does not mean better. So taking more land and preventing it from being harvested does not always mean that it's better to take more land. So it is a really fine balance, and I feel like if we push too hard, we're going to get rid of the ability to look at each individual situation individually as a community, and you take away that you force landowners to do a specific thing, which is above and beyond, then they're not allowed to look at each individual piece of land to say, well, this piece of land may need 50 more feet, not harvested. This piece of land looks, every ecological property should be, I'm stuck. All I know is this. Yeah, if we force to switch that balance over to more environmental or more recreational, and we lose the economic, then the whole table's going to fall over, and that's.
Yeah.
How are we doing so far? I mean,
I
we're
think we're
worrying
doing
the heck
good.
out of this topic, but you know what? I think the forests are being managed pretty well. We're planting a lot of little trees, which give us more oxygen and sequester more O2. We're taking down some big ones that are now using more oxygen than they produce, right?
I agree.
But the
So-
soil, what's happening with the soil is
Yeah.
what I think Jed could speak to that probably, but
Yeah.
the soil is what's going to dictate in the next cycle what happens, whether the trees that grew 300 feet and now grow 175 feet, whether they're going to be 100 feet tall. The soil is what will dictate whether we're Spain or whether we're Lebanon or whether we're Oregon.
So I will say, just to answer your question real quick,
Yeah.
it's one study, and never trust one study, but something came out literally last week from one of the researchers at OSU that's looking at exactly that issue, how short rotation, intensively managed forest is affecting soil health. And it was effectively, they thought it was going to show a slight decline, especially in the carbon sequestration, and it showed it was no impact. And so I'm happy to share that with you. I, again, emphasize it's
Never
one
takes
study.
one study.
Because I see some folks point at one study a lot and try and over extrapolate that. It's something that is thought about. And there's probably some level of erosion with intensive forestry. It's not a lot because we know it's not getting into the streams a ton, so it's not going into the waterway, so we're not losing a ton. It's not like back in the old days where they just, are you talking about like nutrient management or?
Well, so like soil science is actually my major, so that's why that's kind of like always kind of underpinning of what I do. But so like in a forest we think of is all different species that are involved in the forest, and all those species essentially grow the trees that we want to harvest. So in a simplified system, like simplified agriculture caused the
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 Dust
Dust
Bowl.
Bowl, for example, simplified forestry, simplifies the system to where the soil processes that create the aggregates in the soil, that create the nutrient cycling in the soil, all that is slowed down. And the evidence, I guess, of that would be how tall do the trees grow in the same period of time, how much, it's hard to say because if you're planting on a 15 by 15 but it was interesting, the presentation in Klatskanai, so I'm from Klatskanai, and Klatskanai actually has probably, and Napa, some of the best Douglas fir growing in the world, Douglas fir growing soils in the world. So the school board had 3 logging companies were represented, and my family has actually had a logging company as well, and I'm logging actively right now. And my dad has timberland in Klatskanai. So the school board meeting, we were talking about, well, here's the 6 acres that the school owns that's, quote, mature forest because the trees are going to be succumbing to fusarium or whatever, the root rot, and so the determination was made, and they put out for bids, and everybody had a bid on logging this. And I presented that we should think of agroecological management because even though it's been going great to this point, the future dictates, how we treat the whole system is dictated by how we treat the whole system. And at first there was a lot of opposition, but it ended up that the people who were from long-time logging companies and logging interests that could actually say, hey, I've seen the trees growing from when I was a kid. I'm now 50, 60 years old. And they ended up getting behind it really strongly, and they created a community forest that was valuing the forest for more than the trees. And it was interesting that it was the logging families that had been against this, Evensons and several other of the prominent logging families, that got behind it and said, yeah, if we want our kids to have a stake in the forest and have a future in the forest, we need to teach them that the forest is more than the trees, essentially. And so they they got grants, and they set up this school-owned forest as a incubator to incubate the understanding of the forest in that way. And I guess that's where the soil includes all the organisms involved, and we have so much less diversity in the forest now. I think the takeaway point that I think from the whole discussion to this point is that we should actively manage our forests, but that we should also balance it out. If the state is doing it, if they're not, we should make sure that it's balanced out for water systems, for diversity of species, for soil, and we should incentivize that in some way. But the takeaway I think we all agree on is that we should manage the forest actively. That doesn't mean that it all needs to be cut down. Managing it could be that there's old growth forest that comes back that was lost, in the past, that it just makes sense that it should be in this space. But we should actively manage the forests, that I thought was takeaway. So
What was the second part of that?
I don't
And
know.
that second active managed forest, help me.
He said it doesn't mean that we have to take the trees
And the
down.
forest is more than the trees. We've got
That's
water system and all
Or you got
the
the,
species involved.
you've got all the
Right.
species, you've got all the wildlife, you've got the bees, you've got the.
And we
Yeah.
have a lot of products too that are not, that we, it's sort of like if somebody's growing one thing,
That's very
they forget that there's 100 other products that could be important in the
Well,
future.
that accident happens in farming all the time.
And who had their hand up?
I did.
But I don't think Pam's talked for a while.
Go Pam.
In a way, I disagree, Brady. I think that in order to achieve this question that we're working on, how we can balance things, is that some areas, probably not private timberlands, because you guys are for-profit companies, you have a commodity to sell, but maybe Oregon Department of Forestry, some of our public lands should not be managed. Now, I'm not talking about plantations that are susceptible to fire. Those definitely should be
Everything's
managed.
susceptible to fire up here.
Right, but plantations are more so because they don't have the diversity of species.
So when we
I-
talk.
no, let me
okay,
finish.
Finish,
Thank
and then
you.
I'll continue, okay.
We have no federal forests here for carbon sinks. The only public lands we have in this county are Oregon Department of Forestry lands. And there's less than 1/10 of 1% of older forest structure, not even old growth. And some of those should be left unmanaged if, as a laboratory. Because, believe it or not, before people came along and started managing, nature did okay by itself. And like Brady said and Connie said, the soil health. I watched a 200-acre parcel next to me get harvested, and it had been older forest structure. And that soil, that loam, it was deep, it was rich, it was thick. When they were finished with that harvest, with all the machinery, that soil was like talcum powder. There was nothing left. And of course they sprayed to kill the alder, which does fix the soil with nitrogen and in the long run produces a healthier forest. And for fire protection, alder protects the forest. Alder is one of the last things that will burn. If you get rid of all the alder, then the plantations are more susceptible. So it has a higher moisture content. I would propose that or suggest that we have some areas that are not managed. And again, not on private lands, but on public lands that are left alone.
So when you speak of plantation style,
Excuse me, but we have all these people waiting, so let's get caught up.
I was just going to, and some of what you talked about spraying, and I wanted to, wrinkle up. I think that my concern is that can we incentivize things like what Brady's talking about is somehow within the county that are healthy. I feel like some of our forest practices are patterned after our industrial agriculture. And I'm certainly not an expert at this, but I've been observing things getting cut, and then they go put all these little trees in, and they're all the same kind of tree, and then they come through and they spray for the weeds and that kind of thing, and that's just industrial agriculture. Is there a way to incentivize something beyond that?
It's a real forest.
I think there's a breakdown of communication between the timber industry and the community. I don't know, because a lot of those sprays are not hazardous to. They spray and it creates bee habitat. So it depends on what the spray is made of. I know a lot of agricultural sprays, they're using a flower. Yeah, go right ahead.
I would like to second that.
Yeah.
If we can keep some order to who speaks and
Yeah.
just so we
Sure.
because we're going to get into some broader
Sorry,
conversations.
Suzanne.
Oh, is that all you wanted to say? Did you
Well, I have my hand up. I'm not sure
Go
what
right
order,
ahead.
so I'll defer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wanted to actually go to touch on two other topics, because I want to say I amen to Pam and Carol that I really agree. Connie. So the thing on Dogami and FEMA, the high slide areas.
Let's go back up that way.
Okay, I'm sorry.
What was your second one?
Oh, there was that one, and the other one is about economic development and reliance on timber funds. I wanted to comment on those two.
Okay.
I just wanted I wanted to just bring up something to consider with a non-management perspective, and to caution the group to consider that very cautiously, and that doesn't come with saying that you have to cut trees down for commercial reasons. And I think the instinct is that when we live in a system where it can be perceived that there's an intensive management system, that to do the opposite is beneficial. And I want to bring in several case studies, one after the other, from California. I'm from California, and we have intensive fire problems there because forests have not been managed in the exclusion of fire. And we have fuels here, they are trees, and so we might not have an ignition source that's historically going to ignite that source, like lightning here, but make no mistake about it that everything that has a leaf on it here is fuel and it will burn. And so under the right circumstances, if it's an alder, if it's a pine tree, if it's something, our ignition sources these days are humans. So if we can get in that human constitution, so that's something Oregon State Extension helps out with is to help, landowners and people, manage for that and prepare for those disasters, whatever it might be. But a no manage, a set aside and do nothing approach is there are some science around that where that is actually more harmful to those forests. And just to say that humans have always been a part of our forests here before European colonization, and they were actively managed by the indigenous people that were here. And so we live and work in these forests, and to think of it as something that's separate and that we aren't a part of, I think has some consequences that are negative to that forest overall. And there's some science I could share with the group, but that's not to quash that energy of we can do something else. It doesn't have to be like this. We have these values that are different than what might be an industrial forestry perspective, and I think there's full support from and to encourage that energy.
And we have just a few moments left before we jump to something else. Okay, jump back up here. How might a goal or policy encourage update of the Forest Practice Act to take into consideration changes in the climate and the new information from the geologist? Can somebody help? I looked for that. What is new information?
Dogami is updating their landslide hazard maps. A Slido. I don't remember when they're gonna. Did they release it already?
I think they just did.
They just released it, so
Oh.
we haven't really dug into it that much. But there is new information out there, and FEMA just updated its flood maps. In 2018, they became active. So that's the new information.
And Suzanne, your comments on those?
Well, just the Dogami slope slide area thing and clear cutting, I think it's something that has come up in other times when there have been bad slides and there's been a clear cut. I think there can be linkages with slide hazard, which is, I think, why it's brought up, is what you just mentioned on the slide, the Dogami slide hazard. Is that how you put it?
I haven't looked at the
No,
new
but that's, I
maps,
think,
so I don't know what kind of.
I think that part is
risk they're
what this is
looking at.
all about.
Okay.
And then for changes in climate, it is affecting our trees, and we might, I can't really, I think it's a really big thing, the climate changes, but I don't want to speak to that right now.
Well, I would say that. Oh, I'm sorry, you're going.
Well, just working with Diane, where ODF has what they call an HL layer, which is a high landslide hazard layer. And so if you file a notification somewhere in proximity to one of those zones, then you have to go through an entirely different process. So the potential for landslides in relation to improvements, dwellings, highways, those type of things are considered. I'm not aware of Dogami. I also want to make a comment that the Forest Practices Act has been updated, amended over time. If Dogami brings new information to the table, I'm sure that will get folded in to what we do on the ground and how ODF administers.
At the policy level, where will it be folded in?
State agencies.
Forest
Practices
Practices
Act. They're under the
Forest
government.
Practices
It's just
Act doesn't
talking
show up
to each other.
here. Yeah.
Great.
So Dogami, there's a LIDAR. So LIDAR maps can be very interesting to look at, to see what the lay of the land is. And the Dogami website, at least the Department of Geology or whatever that so if you put together what is available on that website, which they'll show, you can do shading for steep slopes, that goes from yellow to red to whatever, and you can essentially get an idea of the lay of the land, and you can see it because the LIDAR gives you like a visual of what the land is shaped like, and then you can add the trees. So I'm saying more than this is the regulation, but there also is a resource behind it. So you can put one of the layers as the top level of the trees, or you can take the trees out. But if you put that resource together with the soils resource, then you start to get into the area that I'm talking about with agroecological management, where you can look at best agricultural practices applied to forestry or whatever. You can look at where trees should be grown in plantation style, where they should be managed as more of a set-aside to incubate old-growth forest systems, where you could grow a 300-foot tall tree, and where a tree will only grow 150 feet tall, for example. Well, that 300-foot tall tree is worth 5 times as much as that 100 whatever, because of the quality of the timber. So the Pareto principle is that you make all your money on 20% of your resource, and the other, so that our forestry situation is the same. It's the 80-20 rule. They're managed as somebody who's kind of, if we go into something ignorantly, we would be managing 100% of the resource to receive 20% of the profit. If we manage in a different way, then the management inputs go into 20% of the resource, and you still get the full profit, the same profit, minus because you subtract out the expense of managing a low-producing resource. And that's where the balance is between, in my opinion, that's where the balance lies, where forest and timber harvest practice wins, or set-asides and ecological, other uses of the forest win, is if we can use these resources for more than what they're prescribing, then we can look at, where the soils are documented for where a fir tree would grow in traditional times 240 feet tall in 40 years, for example, and where it would grow. They have all these resources on the Web Soil Survey. But that's my 2 cents on the 2 things, the Dogami and the climate change thing, because, the best thing we can do for climate change is to create more sustainable forests and more, a better balance of what we're using the land for. Sorry I'm talking so much when I talk.
Back to what you were saying just very quickly about Forest Practices Act in high landslide areas. I agree, ODF is right on it. In this district, they are out monitoring harvests. But accidents happen. Equipment fails. There's just been one just south of Highway 26 where it was a designated high landslide area, and ODF had their geologist out. He flagged the area above the home and above a fairly significant wetland pond right along the Nehalem River as no harvest area. But equipment failed, and I don't know all the details, but a significant amount of mud, I guess, I don't know what else to call it, flowed into the pond, degraded that wetland. And the people living in the home below, even though they've set aside I don't know if it's 50 or 100-foot buffer above the home, they're terrified to live in their home because they are going to harvest above it. So, that's my 2 cents. I think our Forest Practices Act need to be stronger in high landslide areas.
So I've got as far as the purview of this group goes, that is perhaps an excellent example, because that's exactly the sort of thing you want to avoid, right? If we were doing that now, would we approve that home to be built adjacent to?
As
And
a
that's
next law.
one of the things I was speaking to at the very start about the fragmentation of
Right.
ownership and management types. Is definitely something that I think that this group does want to take very seriously. Like how we're planning our county and where different things are
Zoning.
allowed to go.
And I agree.
Water
Yeah.
definitely figures into that too, right? I mean, do you want to build more homes on a place with a seasonal water supply that may be variable? Just a quick thing I wanted to bring up is just this discussion as a whole. Privately owned forestry is a really interesting kind of mental exercise, right? Because it is privately owned land that's being managed for a function, which has a lot of environmental co-benefits, right? That you're not going to see from developed, like urban development or standard agricultural development. So we look at it and we tend to think of it as, we see all those resources, and it gets a little muddy there about what exactly that is. You know, it's like we're saying, what do we want to derive from our forests? And I think that it's important for us to keep in mind, would we apply these same questions to other types of privately managed land? Would we say, you know, all the farmland in the Willamette Valley, that used to be an entirely different ecosystem type that's just gone now, right? And would we take what we're saying here, well, how do we want to manage our oak savanna? Well, the oak savanna's not around anymore. And I'm saying this, I'm saying this personally. I'm not speaking as an employee of my company, because I'm also not trying to indicate that there shouldn't be management regulations. There definitely should, because we want best practices to be followed to make sure that there's no damage to the community. But it's because there's that murkiness, right, between federally owned forests, state-owned parks, state-owned forests, privately owned forests. I personally think it was kind of a mistake in the industry to start calling, to revert away from the tree farm terminology. Back in about the late 90s, people they decided for PR reasons they didn't want to say that anymore, and it kind of muddied the waters a little bit. And so it is land that's being managed for a product that everyone out there is consuming in their own way, or at least our society is consuming. So
Good. And we will move to public comments.
Which part of it made it?
So as the county planning, I mean, it's a zoning situation for the most part, isn't that kind of what the county plan is it addresses zoning, it addresses whether something is forest lands, whether it's farming lands, whether it, so on and so forth, residential. And I really want to piggyback on what Jed is talking about that fragmentation of where we're building our homes versus what you're building your homes next to. And kind of trying to protect the future homeowners a little bit more. I don't know if we can address like can a realtor say, or should a realtor say, well, this is an active logging operation. So, because I know that there's an ORS law in place that is supposed to protect farm and forest lands and active use of those lands, and that needs to be addressed or acknowledged prior to home builders or purchase of residential property. So is there a way for us to develop wording or something to encourage disclosure, to encourage not only disclosure, but to encourage that open dialogue between prior to home ownership or prior to residential development, or when our residential developers are purchasing property for a development, that there is this, protection to the industrial side or the farmer, the potential farmer or the forester,
To
the
continue
owner, to work their property. And it doesn't matter what the product it is. It could be a dairy, it could be, forestry, it could be, but somehow to develop wording to protect the dairyman, to protect the forester, to protect the working product.
In real estate, when I was doing it, which was
Not that
before
long
your
ago.
time. If, for instance, if there was an airport, which we have little airstrips out in the hills and stuff, the people who moved in next to it signed a waiver of remonstrance, meaning I accept that there's an airstrip there. There will be traffic. There will be noise. There will be buildings to house the aircraft and that sort of thing. So you sign the waiver. If you live in Hillsborough and the pattern of the aircraft goes across the top of you, you have to, in order to buy that house, sign a waiver that says, I'm not going to go out and hang a sign on me and say, it's too noisy in my neighborhood because the aircraft is flying over it. It's the same thing, don't you think? I'm going to move in next to a working forest that will eventually be
cut down.
Exactly. And so I'm signing to say I understand that's how that works.
Owner view.
The big rigs are going to be driving past my house for 3 or 4
But
months.
you do hear about it all the time.
And the
So
county
hear
does
about
that
it
at
all
this
the
point with forestry, right?
Does the county do that? I guess.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we get in our office multiple times a week, probably, people who would like to build a dwelling out in the middle of the forest. And they found some little tiny piece of property that actually might even be a buildable lot of record, but it's out in the middle of the forest, and nobody else has ever found it, and they want to be there. And it's not going to pass a template test. And that's something that I can talk to you about later.
Sorry.
It's not going to pass a template test, so they may have some other ideas about how they're going to do it. But the fact is, if somebody does manage to find a piece of property that will pass a template test, one of the things that they're going to have to agree to is signing a resource disclosure statement that says they are not going to sue somebody for, well, it's for ag lands too.
Okay. Or
It's for
To protect.
the typical practices that are used in forestry or agriculture. So they're not going to attempt to sue somebody for using the pesticides or the herbicides or whatever.
Spraying.
So that is a very typical condition of approval, and it has to be recorded with the county clerk against the property. That means anybody who is doing their due diligence to buy that property is going to run into that document. So that sounds to me kind of like you support that we continue to do that. That is actually a requirement already. Okay, so you don't want it to go away. Okay,
No,
got it.
that's
Well,
not
not
construction.
that it needs to be changed though, because it needs to be updated to the best practices. So like, for example, if you said you're not going to sue for pesticide, for example, and the pesticide, there's a lot of issues there that the county needs to kind of step back
It
and
just
lit it.
says basically the standard practices.
Right.
It doesn't
It
actually
limits the amount-
specifically say those things. I use that as an example, but it's typically talking about just standard practices in the forest industry or standard practices in the ag industry, so that the neighbors do understand that they are next to a working forest or they are next to a working farm, and they don't get to complain about the smell that the pigs are going to produce, for
I've seen the
example.
pesticides, right? I just was suggesting that we don't necessarily just blanket approve it, but that we update it, because in the future, the same practices that were considered safe in the future might not be considered safe. And so they should be, every citizen should be empowered to be able to address the issues that come along, even if they're pesticides.
So I have 3 points I wanted to touch on. One is just, I know in California, they're really stressing building of homes with fire protection. Metal roofs, there's a whole study now, how do you protect your home from fire, which I would love to see incorporated into county building code stuff. And the other thing is that I believe, and I've mentioned before about cluster development, that I would love to see cluster development studied and implemented more. Here, when there used to be the F20, which keeps saying here it's no longer enforced, because of that isolation of homes and forests and stuff, which is an issue, it was applied also to everything along the Nehalem River. So there were a whole lot of F20s that you could no longer, you had to combine and have an F80. It decreased buildable lots. I would like to see some of that stuff to be worked up for cluster development where you have more homes, not just the 5-acre minimum lot size, which is what we have out here, but you can take a building site of an acre, permanently designate as in cluster development all that land that's not going to be developed in perpetuity for the land that it was for agriculture or forestry, and that the cluster development meets certain requirements, such as we have a fire department out here, we have the whole road interface to get to properties. If it's within that area that can be protected from fires, that you can have higher density for, otherwise I don't know how many buildable places we have anymore. It was another discussion we
I
had.
agree with you.
Can I?
Yeah.
Courtney?
And then, can I just, wait, I'm just.
Yeah, go ahead.
So then, the last thing I want to bring up is this, and the thing about timber revenues and decreased reliance on timber funds. One of the big problem with timber funds is that over half of the county are corporate timber companies that use real estate investment, any REITA, Real Estate Investment Trust, and TIMO, which I don't know what TIMO stands for, but there are ways that their tax percentages are 80% less than they were 20 years ago. They put in for fire protection, they do this, you probably know the thing that they do, the publications and the TV ads, but they don't put taxes back into the county coffers. This has created a huge pressure on Oregon Department of Forestry, on all their funding, on the county revenues. I think it went through the legislature that, and you would know the history of this more maybe, about how did it go from these, how could they, like so much of the county land become this tax haven where you don't put money into it. And I would think it went through the legislature and the timber lobby. I would love to look into that. Probably need to go back through the legislature to change that again. But to me, that's the big thing about timber funds. If over half of our land no longer pays into our county coffers, of course it leaves a huge hole and a huge deficit. That's it. That's my comment.
I just wanted to go back to your cluster. Were you wanting to take that 5 acres and break it down into smaller parts
So
to be able to turn into residential to create?
Yeah. Let me just. So cluster development, we've got 5 acres.
Yeah.
Cluster development is if there are rules, which the planners could help with more.
Yeah.
If you had a building site here, the rest of this, which was RA5, and you had a possibility of building one house on RA5, if you build that house on 1 acre, that other 4 acres stays then ag forest.
And you're wanting to take those other 4 acres and do something different with them and create?
Keep them in agriculture.
Oh, keep them in agriculture.
So it's the
I thought you were saying, sorry.
right. But also, I mean, there are ways that you can play, because we have cluster development on the books. And I think it's a way to, but I think this F80 thing, I would love to see, like, where were we at 20 years ago, whatever it was, when it went from F20 to F80, of all that much more possibility to have a building site on that original F20. And I know Cow Creek, there were some places, there are places around that are really limited.
On the cluster development, though I don't know if I completely understand the definition of it, but for example, on Hamlet Road, it's like, I'd like to see, if we are going to provide some additional ways to increase housing in certain places, it's like, so why not allow maybe more housing or to adjust the way the zones work along the roads, like along 26, along Hamlet Road, but back to the idea of having a house clear off in the middle of the forest somewhere. My conditional use permit fit the template test because there's a lot of historic neighborhood along Hamlet Road. So I'm just thinking that if we are going to try to balance housing and farm and forest, just maybe look at you know, proximities to roads and highways and that kind of thing.
So I think one thing too that we shouldn't forget, I think, is when we're talking like the idea of fragmentation. So like, for example, if we were saying that we think that a typical tree farm should be 100,000 acres or 40,000 acres or whatever, or if we're saying that a typical tree farm should be a minimum of 200 acres. A tree farm, I'm saying, you know, like speaking in the older terms of the Forest Practices Act, right? So, right, like with a dairy farm, maybe 1,000 acres is a typical size right now. And then there's, but that doesn't mean that that's the best thing looking forward for in our county, in our situation. And so, like with the idea of agroecological management, it's much more, it needs more people. To manage land in an agroecological way needs probably less machinery and more people because it's a much more complex system. And that means people that are involved actively in management, for example, right now you could take 200 acres and you could buy 200 acres and I think you could build a house on it and, you know, essentially that's the minimum size. And seems like, considering that a lot of the forest, that doesn't seem like an unreasonable size for timberland management to me. But I guess my point is like that the intention of the law is not to preserve 100,000 acre tracts that don't have houses on them or people involved. The intention is to create a system where the people that are on the land are involved in the management of the land. And the people who are on the land that aren't involved in the management of the land are essentially a mistake in that rural area. You know, it's not like you can turn it back, but you can look back and say, well, we messed up there because most of the people that live there make their livings outside of the land and come back and spend their dollars on the land. So that was not the intention of the law. The intention of the law is that the people that live on the land, you know, in some way, so if it's cluster development, maybe it's a community of people that collectively do that. So that's, I don't know if that's confusing.
Well, and I think just, if I could just add to that, on Hamlet Road, the idea is that your houses are near the road, so, and the landowner, like myself, for example, and several, I mean, it's a historic community, that the houses are close to the road, so you still have a lot of the land that's forest, that's ag, but the person gets to live on the land to manage the land, which is what I'm thinking you're saying.
Well, I mean, that's still legal. I mean, that's what's promoted, but I don't think that's been the effect if we look at. So
Right.
moving forward, we should have that effect.
Well, I'm kind of in the cluster housing, so on, development path here. And I'm just thinking of an example here, where you have, a landowner has 40 acres and 35 of it is readily accessible to them, but, 5 of it is unusable or kind of weird, or you can't really use it for anything. But unfortunately, you're stuck in a farm forestry zoning and you can't zone under 5 acres, so you can't sell it for a residential development, which would be the only real good reason it could be used for something. And so you could, I'm just thinking of a zoning thing. Is this the correct situation where you present an idea of could we allow this 5 acres to be zoned instead of 5 acres as 1 acre apiece and open up 5 houses?
Marginal lands, it's a perfect idea.
I don't know if that's something that is this the proper form
the county
to
changed
present
that
it?
zoning in our area sometime in the 80s, I think. I can't remember when it was. They went to RA2 instead of RA1, which took away the opportunity for development in a large area the Napa Swenson area.
In the late 1990s,
Was it 90s?
In the late 1990s, the state of Oregon, and I think it was finally approved in 2000, the state of Oregon required that all of the rural lands, which is the RA1, RA2, RA5 zoning, that we have a minimum of a 2-acre lot size.
2 acre, yes, and that was
A minimum
changed, yeah.
of a 2-acre lot size. The RA1 zoning, the county adopted to a 2-acre in, I want to say about 2000, 2001, somewhere in there. The RA1 zone did not change in any other way except the minimum lot size. The RA1 and the RA2 are virtually identical. They are not identical. It's close, but there are a few uses that are allowed in the RA1 zone because it's typically in smaller neighborhoods. And there are many, many, many substandard lots in Napa and Swenson. Some of them are a 1/4 acre.
Oh, yeah, there are some really.
There are, yes,
Yes,
but
no,
I do remember, see, the part of the property that I own used to be RA1, and now if we want to sell it, we have to sell in 2-acre lots.
2-acre
yes,
pieces,
2-acre pieces, which it eliminated a lot of area there that for development.
Well,
That's,
and it increases the landowner's cost of the potential buyer also, because instead of paying taxes on 1 acre, they're paying taxes
It's
on
on
2,
two.
which then, it puts them,
It's more expensive.
it's more expensive. Yeah, it's just more expensive to develop.
So unless you really want to landscape your property, there's not a lot that you can do with that additional area.
Grow trees.
I have a
Yeah,
comment to,
well, not on an acre.
just to reiterate that,
But
Oregon
I
State-
mean, on the rest of my property. we'll
Oregon
do
State
it.
Extension is connected to resources, and so I just don't want to give the impression either that, that I'm an expert in all things, and that it's not a kind of a top-down kind of system, right? So there are things that we don't know, and so the things that we learn from our community are very valuable to us, like something like an alder like this. So just putting it out there again for this group, I'm here for you guys, and that includes courses, and we just to share with you, Tammy Cushing is a professor on campus who's studying forest taxes and economics and stuff, and we're developing packets that can go to realtors that say, you're a first-time woodlands owner, here's some resources for you. So that's something that the group might be interested in, those types of things, and certainly you could tailor it to your own kind of purposes. So just please, I have cards here, just use me.
Also, extension thing, you also have a wonderful expert inside of the county about hardening of residential homes in fire risk areas. He's one of the smartest men in the field. Yeah.
And we'll move on to the holiday schedule and preparation for Goal 5.
You might want to take a break for just a minute. Victoria is passing down the memberships notebooks for the upcoming goals.
Don't I have those?
Yeah, so Brady gets one.
Tony gets one and Ron gets one.
So are you a volunteer or
I get one.
You need to check. Yeah, Brady gets one too. No, it's a different day. Brady. Sorry for the confusion.
On your way.
Okay, so each one of these is 5 theirs.
While we're doing that, can I say something about the
Okay, so does Ron have
Oregon Forest Practices Act? I think that we shouldn't think of ourselves as victims of the success or failure of Oregon State determinations. I think that we should, in planning for the county, we should say, hey, we're different than some other counties in a lot of ways. This is what we'd like to see, and so we want to develop incentives to move things in that direction, rather than say, well, we can't touch that, we can't touch that. We can be very involved in dictating how the Oregon Forest Practices Act is revealed in our county. And if we're not, it's kind of silly, because that's too far away for them to tell us what to do. Far away for them to tell us everything.
I suggest we do what they did, is have another meeting on this. Again,
Or a portion of it anyway.
portion of it.
Next
I
meeting.
agree.
So you'd like to have a December meeting? So what I was gonna say is, We are planning to take a break after this. We can definitely have a meeting in December. I do worry about weather, inclement weather possibly, just
Yeah.
because of where we are for our meetings. It'll be unique to our area, so we may have to cancel and reschedule, but we had planned to, as staff, take a break, look through all of the input that we've gotten so far, and work on that before we jump into goal 5, because it is
Yeah.
huge.
That's just a portion.
This is just part of it, and it's a
Goal
fire.
5 is
So if members
So-
want to have a December meeting, over, and continue with this topics, you can make a motion.
I have a question,
Sure.
and that is, so we have to start goal 5 in January? Is that
No,
the schedule?
we'll be starting in April, I think.
Well, then, what's planned for January that would cause us to go ahead and take the break and then continue this on
January.
So we're this, sure, okay.
Go ahead.
So, staff needs to take all of the discussion from all of the committees. You are but one committee. There are other committees as well, including the countywide. Staff needs to take all of that discussion and distill it. We need to put it back together into something that comes back to everybody to see how we're doing, see what we picked up, see what you think you've missed, see what you want to add, see what you said, oh, now, we see it differently now, or we've had this discussion. And we need time to do that. Staff, we're attending, some of us, I'm going to 2 or 3 of these things a week. It takes a lot of staff time to do this. So we need a break from you guys, no offense. But we need a break from the committees actually doing the work so that we can produce materials to bring back to you so that we can start up again. We are looking at the size of Goal 5 and what it covers. We need time also to put together the things that you need to have that discussion. The workshops, the speakers, it covers a lot.
So what?
It's going to be wetlands, it's going to be,
So when do you want us to meet next?
well, if you are needing to meet again in December, then Victoria's going to need to take a look at your schedule and see probably, do you have a date in mind for them?
Well, let's see.
The earlier the better.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think what I was asking is why can't we, this meeting, this continuation that's being talked about, why can't that be our January meeting?
Well-
So that we do have, all of us have a break in December.
Right, but actually, we need that, the information from your December meeting for January, for us. So we need to have all the committees get to a certain place. I had hoped originally that we would be through with all of Goal 4 by the end of November. A couple of committees are not making it. You're apparently not going to make it. We need to have all of that done by the end of December because our work begins in January. We'll need you to be concluded.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. That's why I asked the question,
Yeah.
is why
We
we
need you-
couldn't continue in January.
We really need you to be done with it by the end of December so that we can move forward with the staff work, so that we can come back to you
Oh.
with product.
So would the members like to make a motion to have another meeting in December?
I would
On
like
this
to.
topic?
I would move that we do that.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All
Okay,
opposed?
so you're going to have a December meeting, okay.
So
Would she-
our normal meeting time would have been December 17th. I think that someone was expressing they would like to have it earlier than that. I would need to look at everyone's schedule. Is that true?
You could do a doodle poll.
Yeah, I'll send out a doodle poll.
Okay.
And everyone, I have all your information if you signed in, so I send out the agendas. I think you should have gotten a copy. Anyway. All right, be in touch.
Thank you.
And
Interesting.
could I get a motion to adjourn?
I want to stay here for a long time.
Excellent.
I move that we adjourn.
And Pam seconds it?
Second, yes.
We have yeas,
Yeah.
4 yeas, 1 nay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Wow, what a great.
Thank you.
Yeah.